When a man tells you that you are old and dead to him, it's not just words, it's a small earthquake that rearranges everything you built with your hands, your trust, and your time. He said it one night in December, standing by the kitchen counter, his phone glowing in his hand like it was the only thing still alive in the room. His tone wasn't angry, not even cruel, just flat, practical, the way people mention a bill is due or the weather might change. "You're old and dead to me," he said, eyes still on his screen. Then he picked up his glass, drank, and walked away. I stood there, holding a dish towel, my fingers trembling around it, trying to understand how someone could bury you with words and still expect dinner to be served on time. I didn't cry right away. Crying gives words too much power. I just started cleaning the counter, one small circle at a time, until everything shined again. It's strange, the things we do to stay upright. That house, the one he said it in, was the kind of place people drive by and wonder what kind of life happens inside. White stone, tall windows, a fountain in the courtyard that never stopped running even in winter. $1 million home, we used to call it proudly, back when it felt like something we had earned together. We'd bought it 5 years earlier, after he landed a promotion and I sold a design project that finally paid off. I'd spent months choosing the colors, the art, the right kind of light for every room. He used to joke that I loved the house more than him. I used to laugh. Turns out, he was half right. Because when someone starts saying things like that, things that turn love into past tense, the walls start listening. The house feels it, the silence thickens between walls that used to echo laughter. For days after that, he barely spoke to me. He still went to work. Still took his calls. Still posted his smiling photos online. But with me, he was polite, distant. And then, eventually, invisible. I watched him the way you watch someone pack for a trip they haven't told you about yet. He'd come home late, smell faintly of cologne he never wore before, hum to himself while scrolling through his phone. Every time I asked, he'd say, "Don't start, Mia. You're always suspicious of nothing." Nothing. That's what he called the ache sitting in my chest every night. Then one morning I found a bank statement, not intentionally, it was just there on the counter, half folded, transfers. Hotels. Expensive dinners labeled client meetings. I remember the date on one of them, our wedding anniversary. He had spent it at a place called the Glass Lantern, 2 towns away. I looked it up online, romantic, candlelit, couples only. That's when I stopped shaking. That's when something inside me turned quiet. People talk about revenge like it's a loud, chaotic thing. But the real kind of revenge, the kind that grows from heartbreak, starts in silence. It starts with noticing what belongs to you. The house was in both our names, but most of the payments had come from my savings. I designed half the interiors through my company. My name was on the invoices, the receipts, even the art insurance. So I started organizing. Not out of rage. Out of clarity. I made a list, documents, passwords, deeds, bills, property reports. I spent nights scanning everything into a folder labeled, Home Final. It wasn't a threat, it was preparation. He didn't notice. Men who stop seeing you don't notice what you're doing behind the quiet. He still had his little routines: coffee at 6, gym at 7, phone calls in the car. I had mine: paperwork, screenshots, legal articles bookmarked between recipes and design notes. One night, when he was asleep, I opened the safe. Inside was the deed to the house, the insurance, the will we'd written when we thought forever was guaranteed. I read every line. And that's when I realized something he never expected me to see. 3 months earlier, he had changed his life insurance policy. He'd listed his new business partner as an emergency beneficiary. I recognized her name. She worked at the same company. The one he said he barely talked to. It wasn't about money anymore. It was about the insult of being erased in paperwork. He wasn't planning to leave me. He was planning to overwrite me. I sat there in that big cold living room, marble floors, quiet chandeliers, and realized something simple. If he wanted me dead to him, then maybe that version of me could die. And something else could start. That night I drafted an email to a lawyer I'd met through a client. I didn't tell her everything, just that I needed to protect my property interests. She wrote back within an hour. "Let's meet tomorrow." The next morning, I woke up early, made him breakfast like nothing had changed, kissed him on the cheek, and wished him a good day at work. He didn't even look at me when he said thanks. That was fine. He wouldn't be thanking me much longer anyway. When the door closed behind him, I walked through every room and said goodbye out loud, not to the house, but to the woman who had lived in it pretending everything was fine. Then I drove downtown, met the lawyer, and started building a plan. She was smart, calm, and fast. She showed me exactly what I could do. Because he had been using marital funds to cover personal expenses, I had grounds to reclaim majority ownership of the house. Because I'd paid for design renovations through my business, the intellectual property of the interior was mine. And because he had lied about financial transfers, I could freeze the accounts without needing his permission. By the end of that meeting, I had a map. A way to dig through the dirt he'd thrown over me and come out standing. That night, when he came home smiling from whatever life he was building, I smiled back too. I asked about his day. He said, "Don't bother pretending, Mia. You're just bitter because you're getting old." I poured him a glass of wine, handed it to him, and said softly, "You'll want to remember this house, darling. It's the last one you'll ever own." He laughed. He thought it was just another one of my dramatic lines. He didn't know it was the truth starting to take root. And truth, once planted, always grows even under concrete. The next morning began like any other, except I already knew it wasn't. The house was quiet, but not peaceful. It had that hollow echo you get after a party when everyone's gone and the air still remembers the noise. He'd left early for work, whistling like a man who had already won something. Maybe he had. Maybe he thought the silence he'd built was victory. I sat at the kitchen table with a notebook and my lawyer's checklist in front of me. The heading said, Asset Separation Strategy. It felt like homework for a life I never meant to study. I started writing everything I owned, not what we owned, what I owned. Every receipt, every invoice, every item I could prove I'd paid for. I found photos of me working late nights on the designs that paid for those marble floors. Proof is cold comfort, but it's still comfort when you've been told you don't exist anymore. By noon I'd made 3 folders. 1. What's mine legally? 2. What's mine emotionally? 3. What I need to let die. The first 2 were easy to list. The third took the rest of the afternoon. Letting things die isn't destruction. It's mercy. I had to let the version of me that begged to be loved by him die. The woman who excused, explained, waited. The woman who thought being quiet was the same as being loyal. That evening, my lawyer called. She'd filed a protective injunction, temporary, but powerful. Until the court reviewed our documents, he couldn't sell or refinance anything tied to our joint accounts. It was the first wall I'd ever built that kept him out instead of letting him in. When he got home, he didn't notice anything was different. He talked about work, about some new deal he was closing, about how he might go out of town next week for a conference. I listened. Not because I cared, but because every word was evidence. After dinner, I told him I might start freelancing again. He said, "At your age? You should rest, Mia. Just enjoy the house while you can." He smiled like he was handing me permission to exist. I wanted to laugh. Not the happy kind, the kind that escapes when you realize someone really believes their own lie. That night, when he fell asleep, I went into his office. It smelled like leather, printer ink, and arrogance. I opened his laptop and checked the browser history. It wasn't hard to find what I needed. Emails. Messages. Plans. He'd been meeting the business partner every Thursday at a hotel 3 hours away. He'd even sent her photos of our house, bragging about his success. And then I found it, the part that made my chest tighten. A draft of a message to his lawyer. Subject: separation planning. He was trying to transfer the property to a trust, one that would cut me out completely. The file was dated 2 weeks before he told me I was old and dead. He'd been preparing to bury me long before he said it aloud. I didn't cry. I copied the documents onto a USB drive, took pictures with my phone, and emailed them to my lawyer with the subject line, "He's moving assets." I remember the timestamp, 2:14 a.m. At 2:16, my lawyer replied, "Good work. Don't tell him you know. Let him keep digging." The next day, I started my quiet rebellion. I called the accountant who handled our taxes and said I wanted digital copies of all filings for records. She sent them immediately. Maybe she already knew something was wrong. I called the bank and requested separate statements for both accounts. Then I did something that felt small but monumental. I transferred the small balance from my freelance design business into a new personal account, one only I could access. It wasn't much, but it was mine. That evening, he came home late again. He looked at me across the table and said, "Why are you dressed up?" I smiled and said, "Because I finally remembered who I am." He frowned, confused, but didn't ask. Men like him rarely ask questions they don't want the answers to. The following week, my lawyer called with an idea. "If he's trying to hide assets, we can force disclosure," she said. "But we need leverage." I thought about that word leverage. Power doesn't always come from strength. Sometimes it comes from documentation. I went into the storage room that night and started opening boxes. Invoices, contracts, tax forms, even blueprints of the renovation I'd designed myself. Every single one bore my name, my company logo, my signature. It hit me then, this wasn't his house. He lived in my creation. The next morning, I hired a private appraiser. He came disguised as a contractor, but he worked for my lawyer. He inspected every inch of the property, took photos, made notes. When he left, he said quietly, "It's beautiful. Whoever designed this cared about the details." I smiled and said, "She did." That night, my lawyer filed a preliminary ownership claim listing me as primary creative stakeholder and financial contributor. It wasn't the kind of thing that made headlines, just paperwork, quiet, clean, powerful. He still didn't know. He went out the next day, probably to see her again, and texted me around noon, "Order something for dinner. I'll be late." I stared at that message for a long time. Then I replied, "Sure. Don't worry, I'm taking care of everything." He didn't know how true that was. By the time he came home, the lights were low, and I was sitting in the living room with a calm I hadn't felt in years. He poured himself a drink and said, "You've been quiet lately. I hope you're not planning something crazy." I smiled. "No, darling. I'm planning something necessary." He laughed again, the kind of laugh that comes from disbelief, and went upstairs. I waited until I heard the water running from his shower. Then I walked into his office one last time. I opened his drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a diamond bracelet, not new, not mine, and beneath it a folded receipt. 2 days old. Gift wrapped. Her name printed neatly at the top. That was when I stopped calling it a house. It wasn't our home anymore. It was a stage, and he'd been rehearsing his next act. Fine. He wanted a performance? Then Christmas would give him one he'd never forget. Because if he thought I was old and dead, he was about to learn what resurrection looks like. She thought Christmas would be the night. He got the final scene he wanted. Instead, she turned the lights down low, set a single small tree by the window, and let the house do the rest of the work. The place looked like it belonged in a magazine again because she had built it to look that way, and now every detail was a witness. She invited only a few people, but the list was precise: his business partner, the investor who had once praised his vision, the couple from next door who kept an eye on the neighborhood, her lawyer, the appraiser, and the private investigator who'd quietly confirmed the Thursday meetings. She also invited one surprise guest, the woman whose emails had been the missing piece between his drafts and his hand in the cookie jar. She asked everyone to arrive early. No fuss, no drama. Just presents. He walked in with the usual arrogance, polished for the holidays. He carried a bottle of wine like a prop, and wore the expression of a man who believed his private life could be edited out of the public. 1. He kissed her cheek because that is the polite thing men like him do when they think they have nothing to fear. He greeted the partner and the investor, and told the neighbor he'd been busy closing things on the road. When his phone buzzed, he glanced down and laughed at some message. He didn't notice the way the appraiser looked at him, or how the private investigator's jaw tightened. Dinner was a gentle choreography she'd rehearsed in her head 100 times. She served something comforting, nothing ostentatious, food that made people relax and lower their guard. They ate and talked, and he told the same stories about minor triumphs he liked to tell, the ones that made him sound like someone who had built an empire alone. She listened, nodding, always smiling, because she was practicing a different kind of theater, the patient kind that waits for opportunity to speak. After dessert, when the coffee cups were half full, and the wine glasses were soft at the rim, she rose and asked for everyone's attention. He looked surprised, then amused, as if the announcement would be the sort of domestic flourish he could control. She didn't say anything dramatic. She didn't need to. She placed a small stack of folders on the table, and slid one across to the investor. On top was the appraisal with her name listed as the primary designer and financial contributor. She handed another to the partner with the preliminary ownership filing inside. She set a tablet on the coffee table and opened it to a thread of emails, then stood in the middle of the room and let the light from the fireplace warm her face. "Thank you for coming," she said, voice even, the timbre of someone who had rehearsed courage until it felt natural. "I invited you because this house has been a stage for someone else's story for too long. Tonight I want you to hear the facts." She started with the appraisal, spoke about the details he'd praised for years but never credited. The custom joinery, the bespoke lighting plan, the structural alterations that had increased the property value. She explained the invoices she'd paid herself, the contractors who'd been hired on her authorization, the intellectual property she had filed months before their marriage for the design documents that defined the house. Each sentence landed like a small stone in still water. People leaned forward. He smiled at first because he thought the audience was confused, then his smile faltered when the investor read a line aloud and his eyes flicked to the filing stamped by the court clerk. She let the room quiet itself and then she brought out the USB drive. She told the partner she would play a short clip. The audio was a recording from a late-night file he had sent to himself, the kind of voice memo men keep to remind themselves they are clever. In it he described the transfer plan, the trust setup, the instructions to his lawyer about how to reassign assets in ways that would make her name difficult to reach. He joked about practicing signatures and about saving legal fees. The laughter on that recording was the same laughter he used at the dinner table earlier, and in the silence that followed, it sounded obscene. The partner's face went slack. The investor glanced at his phone and excused himself, hands suddenly shaking. The neighbor, who had always felt like a spectator in their lives, closed his mouth and gave her a look that had more apology than he could have voiced earlier. Her lawyer stood and said the words she had been waiting to hear since filing the injunction: "We have a court order in place preventing any transfer. The documents on his laptop are admissible evidence." She didn't need more. The law, like a slow-moving tide, had already erased the shore his plans had claimed. He rose then, like a man who thinks motion will restore command. "This is ridiculous," he said, voice thick with a surprising whine. "Vulnerability. You're making a scene." She looked at him the way people look at small fires before they decide whether to put them out or let them burn a house down. "I'm not making a scene. I'm unmaking your plan. That is different." She reached into her pocket, pulled out the velvet receipt she had found, and set it on the table for everyone to see. "I found this 2 days ago in a drawer. Your handwriting was on the memo for a gift." The room knew then that he had been both found and proved. He tried to argue, to charm, to minimize. He tried to tell everyone she was overreacting, that their private matters had become public because she wanted attention. The investor, the one whose portfolio he'd once wooed with elaborate slides, did not blink. Investors are allergic to risk, and a man whose home had become a legal minefield was suddenly a liability. The partner, who had quietly benefited from their shared public image, muttered that this was not the first warning sign he'd noticed. The neighbor crossed his arms and said nothing, a small fortress of moral witness. Then she did the thing that finally unmoored the narrative he'd built for himself. She told them about the trust she had set up 2 months earlier using the proceeds from a client who had insisted on paying her early for a project she had kept private until she needed it. The trust was not a legal trick. It was a practical vessel. She had placed the design documents, the copyrights, and a controlling interest in the house's value into it with instructions that the house should be preserved for the people who actually made it: the contractors, the staff, the designers, and a fund for women in architecture. She had done the paperwork quietly, paid for it cleanly, and registered it with the proper authorities. He could have no say in that transfer once the court validated her claim. The investor made a sound like air escaping. "You did what?" he asked. "I protected what I built," she said simply. "This house won't be a bargaining chip. It won't be collateral for your ego. it becomes a resource for the work and people who created it. Someone gasped. Someone else clapped, a small, stunned gesture that carried more relief than triumph. He stood at the center of it all, the house and the guests and the evidence closing in, and for the first time he looked small in a way money could not hide. He lunged toward her then, rage like a physical thing. "You can't do that," he shouted. "You'll ruin me." She met him without flinching. "You ruined your chances to claim anything by committing fraud. I simply did what the law allows when someone tries to erase another. I protected what is mine and what belongs to others who deserve credit." The partner reached for his phone and called a lawyer. The neighbor called a friend in the press. The investor excused himself slowly and then left without so much as a handshake. The woman who had received his messages sat quietly, eyes steady. She had been invited not to gloat but to witness the consequence of a man's choices. When the police clerk called the next day to confirm the filing, he was gone. Packed bags, abandoned cars, the kind of erasure that was once their shared script. He left behind receipts, drafts, and the velvet box whose receipt was now a key piece in the file. She sat at the kitchen table and did something small and human. She sliced the wedding cake into equal pieces and handed them out to the remaining guests. They ate with the kind of silence that comes after storms. It was not sorrow. It was a long, slow intake of breath. Later, when the legal notices were final and the house's new stewardship was recorded, she walked through each room alone and touched the places her hands had planned. She opened the design portfolio and smiled at her notes, at the margins where she'd written things no one else had noticed. She had not ruined him. He had ruined himself by underestimating the very person he'd tried to bury. On the last night of that year, as snow began to dust the roof and the streetlights hummed like distant constellations, she stood at the window and watched the world move on. The house did not feel like a victory so much as a home reclaimed. That night she slept without fear. Not because the future held no trouble, but because she had built a life that would survive trouble. She had buried the version of herself that needed permission, and out of that burial came something fierce and practical and new. Christmas had not been the end of his plans. It had been the place where those plans met the person who refused to be silent anymore. He had thought he could bury her with a phrase, with a move, with a signature. Instead, she buried what he thought he owned, his claim to the story. What remained after the burial was not rubble but the foundation she had always been building. It took months for everything to settle, though settle isn't the right word. Some things don't settle, they transform. The court filings, the appraisals, the testimonies, they all did what they were supposed to do. The law caught up to him, slowly but relentlessly. Fraud, concealment of assets, misrepresentation. His name became a headline I didn't need to read. He fled for a while, tried to play the victim in interviews, but the truth traveled faster. It always does. He called once from a number I didn't recognize. I let it ring until it stopped. Then I blocked it, because not every closure needs a conversation. The house felt different now. It no longer carried his shadow, it carried my fingerprints. Every corner, every wall, every window was finally what I meant it to be. Not a monument to a marriage, but a map of my survival. When the paperwork finalized, my lawyer said, "Congratulations, you own the property outright." I thanked her, but inside, I wasn't sure ownership was the right word. Either. I hadn't won the house. I had simply buried what was built on lies and reclaimed what was born from truth. I remember the day I decided to start over. It wasn't grand. There was no speech, no announcement. It was morning, sunlight spilling through the curtains I had chosen myself, and I was standing barefoot in the kitchen holding a mug of coffee. And for the first time in years, it didn't taste bitter. That's how rebirth really happens. Not with fireworks, with quiet. I spent the next weeks turning the house into something new. I painted over the cold gray walls he'd insisted on with warm cream and soft gold. I replaced his heavy leather couch with linen and light wood. The art he mocked as too emotional went back up, and in the backyard, I planted a small garden, rosemary, sage, and white roses. I called it my burial ground, half joking, but it was true. Every seed went into the soil like a promise to myself. To bury what hurt, to grow what stayed. The neighbors started waving again. They said the house looked brighter, softer. It did, but it wasn't just the paint. It was the energy, the kind that comes when a woman finally stands in the space she built and knows she doesn't need permission to stay there. People think revenge is loud. But mine was a whisper. Mine was the kind of justice you water slowly and let bloom in peace. One afternoon, the woman, the so-called business partner, came by. She stood at the gate holding a letter. I could see the guilt before she even spoke. "I'm sorry," she said. "He lied to me. I didn't know everything." I believed her. Maybe because I saw in her the same confusion I'd once lived in, the kind that makes you mistake manipulation for attention. I took the letter. It was from him, unsigned but obvious. He said he missed me. He said he'd changed. He said he was haunted by the way I ended things. I folded the letter once, placed it back in her hands, and said, "If he's haunted, that's good. Maybe it means he finally met his ghost." She nodded, eyes wet, and walked away. That was the last time anyone mentioned his name to me. The months that followed felt strange at first, too quiet, too free. But eventually, freedom stopped feeling like guilt and started feeling like air. I began working again, slowly, one project at a time. Designs that felt personal, smaller homes, women-owned businesses, safe spaces. Every client I helped became a reflection of something I had learned. How to build a life that can't be taken from you. The irony is that people started calling me the buried architect. Someone had shared my story online, the woman who legally buried her husband's house and turned it into art. At first, I hated it. Then, I realized it was perfect. Because that's exactly what I'd done. I didn't destroy what he built. I transformed it into something he could never claim. Every tile, every window, every quiet morning was proof that rebirth can look like stillness. Sometimes I host workshops in the living room now. Other women, mostly those rebuilding after betrayal or loss. They sit where he once stood, and they tell their stories, and we laugh in places where tears used to live. I call it blueprint. Because that's what it really is, a plan for survival. Last week, one of them asked me, "Do you ever regret it?" The house, the fight, all of it. I thought for a long time before answering. Then I said, no. Because everything he buried me under became the soil for who I am now. And that's the truth. The night before Christmas this year, I sat by the window again, looking out at the garden. The fountain was frozen at the edges, the roses dusted with snow. I whispered to the air, "You said I was old and dead. But look at me now, I've never been more alive." The wind didn't answer, but I swear the house did. A soft creak, like laughter in the walls. Maybe it was just the cold settling, or maybe it was what happens when a home finally belongs to the right heartbeat again. Before I went to bed, I walked out to the garden with a small box in my hands. Inside was his last text, printed and folded, the one he sent before everything fell apart. "You'll regret losing me." I smiled, placed it in the soil beneath the roses, and covered it gently. No anger. No pain. Just peace. Because some burials aren't about death. They're about planting the truth deep enough that it can grow into something new. And in that quiet night, surrounded by white snow and soft light, I finally understood he was right about one thing. The old me was gone. But what he didn't know was that I buried her on purpose.